Tonight, we won't chase stars or chart constellations. We'll follow something older, the weight of footsteps pressed into stone. Not the sky's vast chorus, but the murmurs that coil up narrow stairs in the dark. Because not every story climbs upward. Some descend gently, stubbornly into memory. Beneath these hills, Galata doesn't sleep. It remembers through moss-lined railings, chipped bricks, and the slow punctuation of nightcats. Every worn stair holds a story in its curve. Lovers, late for the ferry, merchants whispering secrets into burlap, and poets trying to outrun silence. Tonight, we'll drift downward into that layered hush. Past forgotten lamps and unhurried games, past sesame seeds, old Ottoman syllables, and windows still fogged with coffee steam. And somewhere between the steps and the scent of damp stone, you may begin to sense it too, that quiet intelligence. Cities grow only after midnight dot, so lower the lights. Settle into your corner, and if you can, crack a window just wide enough for a little Istanbul air to wander in. If these kinds of slow journeys ground you, feel free to subscribe. And if you leave a comment with your time and location, who knows, perhaps the next story will take its first breath in your dream. Asterisk, a coffeehouse lamp throws a low ellipse onto the cobbles, and you can already hear the late, steady clack of tablet counters in the back, the pieces being counted, not because anyone will win anything meaningful, but because numbers have a way of steadying the mind. A small brass plaque near the door still uses the old word. Crothane Reading House, a reminder that the Ottoman coffee house promised letters as much as cups. Even if half the letters on the sign have flaked off like pastry, leaving only the suggestion of literacy floating above the steam. Asterisk, at this hour, Galata belongs to people who walk with careful ankles. A porter with a sleep-warmed fez balances a tray of cups inside a circular carrier that looks like a crown built for tea. The carrier is a practical thing. Its ring keeps the saucers from skating off when the alley tilts and then pretends it never did. The porter knows every tilt by heart, the way a ship's cat knows the pitch of its deck. Above, washing lines, cross-like careful handwriting, and one coffee-scented draft lifts a handkerchief so gently that you might believe even fabric is tempted to listen. The steps widen into a pocket-sized landing where a wooden door is propped open with the same worn brick it has used for 30 years. The brick wears a coffee ring, which suggests the door takes breaks too. Inside, the clock is slightly fast because it was set during a rush and no one had the heart to correct it. People here prefer a head start on punctuality, which is to say they enjoy the idea more than the practice. On a shelf, mismatched thinking cups line up like a tidy orchestra of thimbles. 3 carry hairline cracks that have been quietly promoted to character. The talk in this coffee house never quite rises above the level of a lullaby. In the corner, an old water pipe gurgles with the patience of a small aquarium. The Nargil's glass belly keeps the embers moods to itself, bubbling approval whenever a coal is nudged and settling again, like a goldfish that knows it has already circled this castle. The tobacco is Tibeki lush, sticky, cut wider than a thought, and sweetened just enough to make the room smell like a fruit seller's pocket. People describe flavors here with the vagueness of dreams. Appleish, rosish, the general family of sweet. A long-handled tongue-part utensil, part tiny scepter, moves the coal with the solemnity of a court official who has never once hurried. Across from the pipe, the storyteller clears his throat, which in this city is considered a preface equal to 3 pages. He is a meta by training, but tonight he does not command a stage, only a low stool and a handkerchief. The handkerchief is important. It becomes a vizier when folded, a tailor when twisted, and now tied into a faint knot. A fisherman who has too much to tell for a man who rose at 4. The voice he uses is smaller than voices in daylight. It reaches just far enough to curl around the nearest ear and then return, like a cat that refuses the last two steps of a lap. He begins not with a plot of bedtime energy and ambition, but with a smell, the way the harbor smells when nets are rinsed and the iron rings along the pier tap each other like polite coins. Someone laughs softly at the memory of coins. It is that kind of crowd. The storyteller tucks one corner of the handkerchief into his vest and lets it dangle. A gesture that means, I am now a man who has a pocket watch, though he has never owned one. He tells a memory of climbing the same Galata steps at 11, years old with a tray of cups and being told by an elder that the tray is a compass. If it is level, the world is well. If it tilts, the world requires more sugar. It is a philosophy that would fail in a storm, but works in alleys. Between lines, he taps the pipe's clay bowl with a tong, a tiny bell that signals new character, new corner, new pause. There is a rumor that in the 18th century, an official forbade loud storytelling after midnight because the echoes fooled his guard into thinking a crowd was gathering. Whether the rule existed matters less than how convincingly the room nods at its possibility. A clock in the hallway says it is not midnight and also not quite something else. The nargile agrees in bubbles. From the hearth border, a copper sesve is nudged into the heat like a small boat nosing into a current it trusts. Inside is menengek, the gentle cousin in Istanbul's caffeinated family, ground from wild pistachio berries that remember the smell of hillsides even after roasting. This one is made with milk, the color of new rope, and it wears a foam so soft you would let it borrow your pillow. Menengek does not rush. It detours into sweetness, takes the scenic route past the tongue, and quietly sets down a nutty suitcase in the throat. A spoon with a long neck rests across the cup like a tiny bridge to nowhere. In some houses, the spoon is balanced under the handle to keep the foam from fleeing, a precaution that works partly because foam has never been known to flee on its own. The cup, when poured, is ringed with clinging specks, little ores of oil and grounds, and it is these that give the evening its unambitious sport. The saucer goes upside down with the dispatch of a polite eclipse. The cup is inverted like a miniature dome, its rim sealed with breath, its fate sealed with expectation. This is not fortune-telling so much as fortune-steeping. Everything that might be guessed is quietly soaking, and everything that will not be guessed rests anyway, which is a powerful arrangement for a life that insists on movement. Someone presses a coin to the bottom to encourage a path. Someone else traces a star with a fingertip, because the city has already set a precedent for monuments shaped like heavens. A woman who reads cups for her friends, but swears she never reads her own, returns the cup to upright and peers into geography. She names a road, a letter, a remarkably convincing fish, which is the Bosporus opinion of every ambiguous shape. She shakes her head at a clump that looks too much like a knot. It will dissolve with a rinse, as most knots do. In the corner, a man folds his saucer under the cup in the shape of a crescent because he prefers his predictions seasonally appropriate. He will forget them by morning and keep the saucer anyway. Around these rituals, the coffee house continues its small arithmetic. A boy carries the brass a brick of water from table to table, refilling glasses that believe they are the same glass, ancestors and descendants separated by a simple rinse. Sugar cubes clink into tulip glasses of tea for those who refuse to sit. With empty hands, a tongue shaped like a bird's beak doles cubes one by one, and sometimes two when conversation needs nudging. On the wall, a ledger records the evening in a script that almost glides, the proprietor carefully noting who will pay tomorrow and who will pay eventually, which is a chronological system understood universally in neighborhoods with stairs. The ledger has a page reserved for expenses that never arrived. Charcoal saved by ash sifting, lemons borrowed from the grocer and returned as slices, a bag of chickpeas that somehow became the house snack, because it made no argument for or against being a snack. Every few minutes, the hearthkeeper taps the side of the brazier to shake ash loose into a ceramic bowl that once held pickles and now collects embers. A career shift the bowl has accepted without complaint. Outside the door, the alley leans again and the city recommits to night. Far off you might imagine the shadow screen where Kurag and Hasavat once bickered behind oiled paper, but here the only silhouettes are of a hand lifting a cup and of steam practicing its slow handwriting against the lamp. A whisper passes that the Galata Tower watchman used to keep a very small ledger of lights, noting whose window went dark at what hour merely as a way to outwit boredom. If he did, the entries most nights must have read like a poem. Bakery late, tailor late, coffee house resisting. People here have always been sentimental about resistance of that modest sort. The storyteller pauses to sip water, which is the most eloquent break available, and the Narjol, feeling responsible for ambience, obliges with 2 dignified bubbles, asterisk. Eventually, the lamplight thins at the window, the way tea thins when you forget the second cube. A gull draws its chalk line across the clouded dark, testing its voice with a lazy rehearsal. The proprietor begins the nightly reverse procession of closure, a dance in miniature that has improved over decades until it could be done blindfolded. Coals are spread to die like faint islands. The pipe hoses coiled with a kindness usually reserved for rope on boats, cups stacked with paper thin. Felt between them, a habit inherited from a fastidious uncle who disliked the faint porcelain kiss at midnight. A cloth sweeps crumbs that arrived from nowhere and will return there presently. The stove coughs, agrees to sleep, and the copper jars exhale their last soft ghosts. One by one, the men and women stand, stretching the kind of stretch that says, the chair was exactly right. Someone wraps the storyteller's handkerchief around a wrist because in this room objects behave like friends and friends. Sometimes become objects temporarily. Warmth is transferable. At the threshold, a grainy rectangle of light slides across the step as the door draws to, and for a moment the alley listens to itself. It hears the slow sweep of a street broom somewhere uphill, the click of a hook against a shutter, the secret. Rehearsal of a boatman testing his knot on an empty bollard. The air tastes of sesame and iron, a combination known to seaside mornings from Odessa to Izmir, each city claiming it invented both and none insisting very hard. Then the first call lifts. It does not begin as an announcement. It begins as a comfortable clearing of the throat held by air that has been waiting all night for something simple to carry. The Bosporus answers with its gulls, those tidy auditors of daybreak who arrive to balance ledgers the coffee house keeps with crumbs. The sound walks down each lane and climbs each stair, finds the corner where the brick still guards the door, and takes a seat on the threshold as if it too would like to listen to the room cooling. Windows wake in hardly noticeable ways. Shutter's hook gives up and swings open. A line of laundry breathes all at once, and from the docks the engine of a fishing boat breathes, stops, and breathes again like a student practicing the first 2 bars of a song. The proprietor lifts the latch of the metal shutter with a familiar windsmittle, prefers to sing at dawn, and pauses to taste the hour. He straightens the plaque out of habit, as if the last guest might have disarranged the alphabet while no one was looking. He writes a final number in the ledger, not truly necessary, but politely concluding today's grammar. Behind him, the cup. Reader sets the washed saucers to dry on a towel, arranging them in a ladder of circles that looks, if you tilt your head, like a lane of little moons. She yawns into her sleeve, because yawns deserve privacy, and covers the cess with there. Lids, small copper helmets against early dust. Down by the quay, ropes thrum with the certainty of work. Up in Galata, the steps carry the day's first deliberate footfalls, different from night's wandering feet in the same way planned sentences differ from murmurs. The city's vowels lengthen with daylight. Even gulls like to hold notes when the water brightens. A cat settles on the warmest square of shutter and pretends to guard it. The coffeehouse door is shut now and will be shut for an hour that feels like 2. Inside, cooling cups relax. The last stripe of steam decides to stop writing, and the nargile, relieved of duty, rests as if it had swum all night. None of this resolves anything. Coffee houses are not in the business of endings. They unspool evenings. The way thread unwinds from a patient spool without needing to fill a seam. The stones on the stairs will keep their pale gloss, renewing it bead by bead as shoes continue to use them like punctuation. The handkerchief will find a pocket again tonight. The ledger will open to a new page. The meningic will bubble in, small, courteous breaths, and the first call will return to meet the galls as if the arrangement had been negotiated long ago and requires only the signature of dawn. When you finally drift, you may imagine the tray of cups suspended in perfect balance, the little ring steady as a planet's orbit, each saucer holding a moon, each cup holding a sea, and the alley itself yawning in gratitude for another night, whispered neatly into the city's endless caffeinated margin. Asterisk. You might not expect the angle of a brass hinge on a canal lock gate to explain the patience of an entire century, yet here we are, drifting down a sluggish branch of the Staffordshire and Worcestershire Canal, where 19th century Britain quietly timed itself by the squeak of wood on water. The morning mist still clings to the hedgerows like cautious punctuation, and somewhere a moorhen rehearses its one-note aria. But our attention settles on the iron milestone wedged beside the towpath, a knee-high post with hand-painted numerals, now as pale as overbrewed tea, insisting that Storeport is 7 miles downstream and absolutely certain of nothing else. If you remain awake long enough to hear about the second milestone, the one half buried beneath cow parsley and unread since 1923, feel free to subscribe or simply blink twice in polite approval. Milestones, like modest podcasts, prefer encouragement. That doesn't cost much effort. A narrowboat pushes past at a velocity so unambitious that the ripples behind it seem to yawn. Its cabin roof hosts 3 terracotta pots of soil without flowers, a horticultural cliffhanger perfectly suited to our theme. The steerer taps his windlass against his thigh the way an old metronome measures silence, letting us know that locks ahead will require neither hurry nor apology. In the towpath mud, horseshoe prints from a century ago occasionally surface after heavy rain-time capsules shaped like incomplete crescents, each marking the slow algebra that once balanced oats, water, and the exact weight of pottery bound for the Black Country. The hinge on our first gate creaks open not with drama, but with a resigned exhalation, as if accepting that gravity wins every argument eventually, and the water obeys with a sighing swirl too gentle to disturb a single duckweed rosette. Company minutes from 1846 record that paint used on these hinges should be retouched, at intervals not exceeding 18 months, a directive observed with the same intensity one might reserve for politely washing a teacup when done eventually. Never urgently. You can still see 3 generations of green layered like geological strata, the bottom coat a Victorian viridian, the middle a wartime economy shade mixed with extra lamp black, and the top the color of weather that can't decide between drizzle and drizzle's cousin. Each layer flakes at a different tempo, so the hinge narrates history in exfoliating fragments, much like the way a library fritters away old bookmarks. The lockkeeper's cottage nearby carries its own chronicle in bricks, salvaged from 5 different kilns, making the walls look quietly pixelated, an architectural shrug against uniformity. On the sill, a china dog guards 2 rusted padlocks that have not been needed since tolls were abolished. The dog, therefore, has enjoyed the longest unpaid holiday in Staffordshire, a fact no museum bothers to mention. Inside, the fireplace persists, and smelling of toast even on days when no toast is made, having absorbed a lifetime quota of crumbs that now haunt the mortar. The visitor book on the mantel contains an entry from 1974 praising the tea as suitably indifferent. High praise in a region where enthusiasm is rationed for special occasions, like mildly interesting cloud formations. A little farther along, where the towpath tips beneath a sycamore that sheds bark and curly sighs, stands milestone No. 36, painted in 1878 by a man named Elijah Broom, his initials faint on the reverse, visible only when the nettles politely lean aside. Elijah charged 3d per post and was paid in 2 installments, the second delivered 6 months late and minus a halfpenny deduction for paint drips on a company ledger, which seems petty until you recall that drip marks complicate future. Arithmetic. The numerals he brushed were once crisp, but decades of sheep rubbing their flanks against the post have smudged the 3s into shapes reminiscent of stoic seahorses. Local folklore claims the paint contains traces of canal water mixed in for luck, though examination suggests the water was added chiefly because Elijah ran out of linseed oil and preferred not to walk back to town. Nearby, a discarded cargo. Hook lies half buried like a languid question mark, its wooden handle cupped in moss that grew fascinated with its own reflection in morning dew. The hook's iron tip, once polished by sacks of salt-glazed pottery, now rusts in a color palette best described as argumentative autumn. A kingfisher darts past in electric silence, straight as a thrown exclamation, but we decline its invitation to excitement and return to our milestone, where a snail conducts a conference on moisture across the letter S records from the Canal Company archives, penned in looping copper plate, list every repainting requisition with the courtesy of a diary too shy to mention feelings. 1 entry. From 1902 requests, 1 additional pot exterior enamel. Hue as previous, a phrase that suggests color must be inherited like a pewter spoon. Yet by the 1930s, the railways had begun to borrow freight, and milestones were repainted less from pride than from habit. The brushstrokes became streakier, the green less certain of itself, and the spaces between numerals widened as if the painter foresaw emptier cargo holds ahead. Even the measuring chain used to verify mile distances, once kept coiled in a velvet-lined box, was eventually left on a peg where spiders took up the task of binding it with silk. Today the chain resides in the Canal Museum, looped in a glass case, still smelling faintly of diesel it never touched, because memory is sometimes contagious. Visitors seldom linger there, preferring the interactive exhibit where you push a wooden sluice model to watch water whoosh beneath plastic ducts. Yet the chain remains patient, continuing its watch over exactitude no one requests. In a drawer beneath the display sleeps a tin of the original hinge paint, sealed tight but rumored to rattle when storms approach, as if predicting barometric nostalgia dawdled past the next bend, under a bridge whose keystone bears the initials of a mason nobody has successfully traced. The water changes mood from reflective to speculative, mirroring treetops only in suggestion. This is the bridge where toll clerks once noted cargo height by squinting. If barrels scraped the arch, the fee increased by a penny. A piece of economic whimsy that must have delighted account ledgers, later forced to accommodate halfpennies. A slate tablet by the bridge lists toll rates and lettering, eroding into a sort of cursive sleep, each serif drooping like a cat's eyelid at noon. Beneath the arch, you can see the ghost of a soot trail left by the steam tug, Perseverance during her brief assignment in 1912, blackening brickwork and a single stubborn ribbon. The rest of the arch remained unspoiled because the tug's funnel leaned at a polite angle, as if bowing to preleved masonry. The scorched stripe remains today, though soft to a velvet gray that resembles the undercoat of a hesitant cloud. A waterside willow dips its toes here, having misunderstood geography and believing itself a paddle wheel. Its branches catch stray paint chips every spring, confetti from hinges upstream, and release them later like papery minnows. Some chips travel miles before surrendering to silt, extending Elijah Broom's brushwork beyond any warranted evening. Ambles end without decision, and the canal walk we began with closes once more, Hinge settling into its oldest opinion, that nothing important ever happens quickly. The milestones' fading numerals glow for a moment in the low sun, pretending they were gilded all along. Then dusk files them away with the rest of today's unindexed details. A heron lifts off, its wings so large they draft the water into. Reluctant ripples, yet the hinge does not squeak in farewell. It simply rests, confident that tomorrow someone else will lean an idle hand upon its paint and feel the quiet arithmetic of distance. And if by chance you are still listening now, let the next scrape of the lock paddle carry your thoughts downstream. Follow the paint flakes past 7 measured miles, past 3 more bridges, until every numeral, every hinge, every unambitious creek blends into the same long, sleepy ripple that finally convinces even the milestone it has traveled far enough for one patient night. Asterisk. You might not expect an undercooked mixture of graphite dust and Bavarian horse glue to influence the ambitions of an empire. Yet the tale of how pencil lead hardness grades, crept from workshop gossip to international decree, is exactly the sort of patient story that prefers to unfold after midnight. If you remain awake by the time I mention that HB Compromise of 1905, feel free to subscribe with the same relaxed enthusiasm one reserves for sharpening a stub at both ends. I promise the grading committee will never find out. Our journey begins in the dim back room of Johann Faber's Nuremberg factory in the spring of 1858, where a single candle leaned sideways in a draught and softened the shadows of drying pencil slats. The workers measured hardness by ear, pressing each still warm lead against a pine offcut and listening for a sound they described as modestly defiant, a faint crunch like snow interrupted by politeness. They marked the blanks with charcoal numerals that often smudged before lunch, creating a logistical lullaby in which a 2H occasionally masqueraded as a humble B. And nobody minded because schedules in Pencilland were as rubbery as the erasers. Yet to be invented, across the channel meanwhile, London stationers adopted their own sliding scale based on how many strokes it took to write the word indubitably before the point dulled, a test doomed by regional accents. A clerk with a northern lilt could blunt even the proudest 3H in 7 attempts, while a genteel undersecretary from Bath might coax full minutes of legibility from an ordinary HB by pronouncing the I as though balancing a teacup on it. Somewhere between these happy inconsistencies lay the kernel of global dissatisfaction, summed up in a letter from a frustrated surveyor who claimed that imperial acreage calculations should not hinge on dialect. Thus, the first International Pencil Congress was arranged for the back salon of a modest hotel in Vienna, 1883, where delegates discovered that the room's gaslights hissed too loudly for delicate hardness tests. Minutes record a unanimous decision to postpone until morning, followed by 3 pages devoted to strudel variations sampled while they waited, an early proof that bureaucracy, like graphite, is pliable when warmed at dawn. The Congress attempted standardization with the aid of a calibrated mahogany board into which each lead was pressed at a fixed angle, producing marks ranked by darkness, a method elegant in theory and delightfully useless in practice. Given that a visiting Japanese delegate produced a cedar case marvel that refused to conform, writing with a silky graphite line the board called neither here nor there. Instead of arguing, they broke for coffee and agreed to reconvene the following year, inaugurating a grand tradition of annual postponement that would stretch all the way to the 20th century. Paper manufacturers secretly rejoiced. Ambiguity meant drafts were rewritten, orders replaced, consumables consumed. Somewhere, An accountant smiled into his ledger, the way a cat closes its eyes when discovering a sunbeam. By 1897, the debates had settled into a sleepy rhythm. Introduce a detail, expand it into historical footnotes, sprinkle dry jest, then drift back to where they started. An excellent soporific cycle if you were slipping toward dreams. The Sixth Congress in Zurich spent 42 minutes arguing whether the letter B should stand for black or bold, only to realize the German and French translations would tangle either way. They agreed to remain pleasantly uncertain and rewarded themselves with apple fritters. The meeting secretary noting in precise italic that fritters were of commendable fluffiness. That report, now preserved in a museum display few have visited, still smells faintly of nutmeg, proving that some archives hold aromas as well as facts. Meanwhile, school children everywhere enacted their own silent referendum on pencil grades. On humid afternoons in Madras, standard issued 2 billions melted to the consistency of overripe mango on slate boards, while in chilly Ontario, the same grade squeaked like startled mice on rag paper. Teachers adjusted discipline accordingly, deducting marks not for poor penmanship, but for the acoustics of complaint. An inspector in Ottawa calculated that each squeak reduced attention spans by half a second. Multiply that by 50 pupils, and one obtains a morning lost to graphite gossip. Such observations crept back to the Congress in the form of politely despairing letters, their envelope corners blunted as though empathizing with the topic. The delegates thanked each author for valuable insight, filed the correspondence by city, and continued to quibble about whether an HB should leave a shine visible at dusk or only under noonlight. Finally, in 1905, the so-called HB Compromise emerged in Paris, not from heated negotiation, but from a waiter misreading the luncheon order. He served half the table brioche marked H for honey glaze, and the other half baguettes stamped B for beurre, prompting a delegate to joke that hardness and blackness could coexist, so long as nobody asked the bread to be both. Laughter, soft to the collective stance, and a draft scale, 9H down to 9B, was scribbled on the tablecloth in an 8B prototype provided by Faber himself. Its line so dark the inkstand felt unnecessary. The tablecloth, alas, was laundered before the signatures were copied, and the scale survived only because a hotel maid thought the charcoal doodle charming and traced it onto a postcard she later used as a bookmark in The Count of Monte Cristo. That postcard resurfaced decades later when her grandson donated the novel, bookmark intact, to a municipal sale, where a visiting Czech librarian recognized its sleepy historical significance and tucked it under her hat for safekeeping. The compromise, though unofficial, drifted into manufacturing memos by osmosis. When World War I disrupted supplies of Bavarian graphite, British factories compensated by adjusting clay ratios, effectively sliding every grade one notch toward softness. Nobody bothered to inform exporters in Buenos Aires, who discovered their imported 2H now curdled into mid-afternoon smudges resembling wounded moths. They responded with local hardwood casings that cooled the lead as it wrote, inadvertently inventing the so-called Pampas effect pencils that resisted, smudged by gently chilling themselves in the breeze off the Rio de la Plata. Samples sent back to Europe were admired, studied, and promptly forgotten, because the war ended and supply lines returned to previous temperaments. Yet a century later, some Argentine architects still specified Pampas H in blueprints as a wink to their predecessors. Even though the grade never officially existed. By the 1930s, the hinge that once connected ear-testing artisans to dialect-dependent clerks had rested into a quieter certainty. School supply catalogs worldwide listed the familiar ladder from hardest 9H, brittle as honest criticism down to velvety 9B, dark as coffee left on the hob. The ladder's rungs were finally equal, though climbers seldom noticed. In a modest office in Copenhagen, a standards committee formally adopted the sequence, citing overwhelming lack of objection. The minutes devote more space to selecting biscuit assortments than to the vote itself, a telling measure of how thoroughly boredom had triumphed. From that point on, pencils traveled with passports of predictability, and HB in Nairobi produced near-identical shading to one in Reykjavik, allowing astronomers, cobblers, and crossword devotees to share dull delight across latitudes. Yet faint eddies of nonconformity persist, charming as moth-eaten cardigans. In a dusty hardware shop in Palermo, you may still find a tray of mysterious HB pencils, hybrid curios reportedly commissioned for the inventory tallies of an eccentric ship chandler who believed even numbers tempted fate. Across the Pacific, a lone workshop in Kyoto tunes its 4B leads to an old shakuhachi scale, claiming the graphite should hum ever so slightly when drawn a line rice paper at dawn. And somewhere in Minnesota, a retired railroad clerk swears his stash of 7H pencils squeaks in Morse code during thunderstorms, though he has never deciphered the message beyond the comforting rhythm of dots and dashes dot. So we arrive at our final drowsy realization, a century and a half of calculation, Congress, and candle-lit ear testing ultimately produced a scale that most people acknowledge only when the supermarket shelf is out of stock in their usual HB. The legacy of those delegates, workers, and quietly eccentric waiters now lives mostly in the subtle crunch you feel when the point first kisses paper, a crunch calibrated by untold debates you have kindly allowed to escort you toward sleep. If eyelids still hover open, imagine the postcard bookmark resting in a library drawer, its penciled ladder patiently waiting for the next curious hand. Or picture Elijah Broom's green paint flake drifting past on a Staffordshire canal, bumping gently against a floating splinter of cedar from a forgotten 9B, the two relics nodding to one another before sinking into silt where grades no longer matter. Let that meeting of fragments be your lull, and allow the quiet arithmetic of hardness and blackness to fade into the wider, grayer hush that pencils promised all along. Asterisk. You might not expect the exact depth of a humble pine drawer, measured in the soothing quiet of a reading room, to sway the fortunes of librarians from Aberdeen to Albuquerque, yet here we are, floating gently among measurements no thicker than a thumbnail. If you are still awake when I reach the part about a 1927 memorandum entitled Allowance for Felt Pads, you are invited to subscribe, though please do so with the same leisurely hesitation the memo exhibited while traveling through 6 regional post offices. In the earliest evenings of the 19th century, library catalogs lived in whatever boxes the local carpenter fancied, resulting in a polite chaos of cards tilting like sleepy sunflowers. At the University of Tübingen, a professor's handwriting flowed so extravagantly that most cards required a discreet sideways nudge just to fit. In Boston, meanwhile, a brusque sea captain's donation of teak planks produced drawers so narrow the call numbers whispered apologies as they scraped the sides. The discrepancy inspired no real alarm until a traveling scholar with an umbrella too wide for the coat hooks complained of sore knuckles from repeated rummaging. His letter of protest, penned in long, sighing sentences, found sympathetic ears in the corridors of the Prussian Ministry for Enlightenment, which convened a subcommittee on receptacles, subdivision drawers. One rainy February afternoon, when there was nothing much else to do, the committee's first act was to inspect 43 libraries, comparing drawer depths with the zeal of naturalists measuring beetle antennae. They traveled with folding rulers and an oak sample whose edges were rounded to prevent damage to mahogany. Their reports are deliciously uneventful. Found drawer 12.3 centimeters. Smelled faintly of lavender paste. Decided not to interrupt a patron who was napping nearby. Still, the data accumulated, and by 1885, the averages gathered into a sleepy sort of curve, bulging around 12 centimeters deep, 14 centimeters wide, 75 centimeters long, numbers unheroic yet oddly reassuring, like the pulse of a cat in sunlight. During one particularly overcast session, a clerk remarked that the curve resembled a quiet hill seen from a train window. This was recorded in the minutes under the heading Topographical Reflection, possibly inspirational. They broke for Cocoa and never revisited the metaphor, but it lingered as small metaphors do, in the smooth corners of future drawer blueprints. Across the Atlantic, Andrew Carnegie's gifts were sprouting libraries faster than ivy and carpenters. From Pittsburgh to Petaluma wanted reliable measurements without paying for European pamphlets. Thus, the American Library Association printed a single-page circular in 1901 recommending drawers no less than 2.5 inches deep, unless regional. Humidity suggests otherwise, a clause so gentle it might have been stitched onto a pillow. The circular traveled by train to Des Moines, where a conductor used it as a bookmark in his lunch car detective novel, thereby missing the postal connection to Kansas City. By the time the paper arrived, 4 weeks late, local builders had improvised cedar drawers 3 inches deep, simply because that matched the width of their chisels. The result, a new, distinctly Midwestern standard that perplexed visiting bibliophiles for decades. One chemist from Prague is said to have spent an entire afternoon adjusting his spectacles in disbelief before concluding the drawers must be experimental, perhaps testing card resilience under extra elbow room. Micro hooks continued to surface like bubbles in a librarian's teacup. In 1912, the Royal Library of Belgium reported that drawer lips carved with a decorative wave trapped dust in the troughs, leading to what a fastidious janitor called emotional sediment. His phrase spread quietly, and soon several institutions filed requests for grant money to remove sources of emotional sediment, though none could agree whether this referred to dust, disappointment, or both. The grant committee replied with a single line, "We feel you," and allocated funds sufficient for 3 feather dusters and 1 philosophical symposium on catalog purity. The symposium resolved that a straight lip aids the soul, then adjourned to taste waffles while snow drifted outside like shredded index cards. During the First World War, oak was requisitioned for rifle stocks, forcing libraries to adopt poplar, a wood so light that empty drawers occasionally drifted open on a sigh of coal furnace air. Readers mistook the motion for ghostly invitation. In Nottingham, a telegram records a patron murmuring, "Thank you, sir," to an apparently courteous drawer before realizing no attendant stood behind it. The incident reached the newspapers as a humorous aside, prompting London manufacturers to add tiny brass catches, thus inadvertently standardizing the audible click librarians still find comforting at closing time. That click, soft yet certain, became a rhythmic punctuation in study halls, like distant knitting needles keeping watch over footnotes. The second great push for uniform dimensions arrived with microfilm in the 1930s. Engineers argued a drawer should accommodate both card and reel, predicting a future where scholars might flip from paper to magnified image without rising from their wooden stools. Trials in Zurich featured drawers partitioned by sliding felt-lined walls. Unfortunately, the felt swelled in humidity and locked. The partitions in place, turning the hybrid prototype into a coffin for whichever medium was unlucky enough to be on the wrong side. Reports described the system as well-intentioned, reminiscent of a polite but stubborn mule. Microfilm eventually chose separate real estate, leaving the catalogs to their ancient oak and poplar, now seasoned into quiet resilience by mid-century. The Library of Congress, mindful that furniture shapes migration, released Specification Z 39.15. Drawers shall be 3 inches deep with a tolerance of 1/64 inch. The specification ran to 11 pages, 9 of which concerned screw types. Somewhere in the annex, an exhausted typist fell asleep over the carbon copy, accidentally inventing the memorable phrase, "Non-critical fasteners may, at librarian's discretion, daydream." The supervisor, fond of whimsy, allowed the phrase to remain. Buyers thereafter placed orders quoting the daydream clause with a wink, as though acknowledging the collective yawn behind so much precision. Freight crates arrived stenciled, contains daydream-ready drawers, which dock workers abbreviated to DRD, convincing a visiting economist that American libraries were secretly stockpiling something called dry radium devices. He wrote a memo. Up the chain. The chain quietly returned it with the penciled note, "Take a nap." Scene shifts now, like lamplight changing angle on polished handles, to the post-war sprawl of university campuses. Metal cabinets replaced wood in laboratories for their resistance to chemical splashes. Yet the heart of public reading rooms clung to varnished maple, claiming the faint vanilla scent calmed late-night indexers. A study in Sweden sought evidence, placing volunteers in rooms scented with maple essence versus unscented control cabins. Results were inconclusive. Most volunteers dozed off regardless, lulled by the study's instructions to file fictional thesis cards under imaginary subject headings such as synchronized yawning and colonial birds. The paper was filed in a real catalog whose drawers met the European standard of 32 centimeters depth, proving once again that bureaucracy eventually manifests itself in timber. Toward the century's close, computers sidled in on plastic casters. Early databases adopted a digital card metaphor complete with an animated drawer that slid open when you clicked search, and homage as charming as it was unnecessary. Librarians chuckled, yet some confessed missing the tactile resistance of a well-oiled runner. An engineer proposed fitting terminals with weighted sliders to mimic the feel. Funding did not appear, but the blueprints survive in a folder labeled Haptic Nostalgia Pending. Today, somewhere in a climate-controlled basement, that folder dreams of approval like a drawer dreaming of fingertips, worth a final gentle mention is the International League of Drawer Pull Collectors, founded in 1978 by retirees who found the curved brass handles aesthetically meditative. They publish an annual journal, Circulation 187, featuring close-up portraits of pulls against velvet backdrops, each caption noting the probable drawer depth it once served. Issue 42 devotes 4 pages to a pull shaped like a sleepy gull recovered from a demolished seaside branch in Devon. The article concludes, "One can almost hear the waves," which may well be the pinnacle of politely boring prose thought, so, dear listener, let these quiet inches cradle your eyelids. Imagine the measured procession of drawers across continents, each the exact size required, give or take the width of nostalgia, to hold cards whispering names of books you may never read, about events you may never chase, because here in the library of near sleep, the catalog itself is the story. Feel the tiny brass catch click, soft, conclusive, content, and allow that click to echo once, twice, then fade into the hush between 2 turning pages, where even measurements fall drowsily into round numbers, and night staff turn the lights down 1 lumen at a time. Asterisk. You may not think the gentle curve of a silver spoon, heated by nothing more urgent than a pocket-sized brass spirit lamp, could determine the punctuality of a cross-country train, but here we are, gliding into a subject so slight that the mind yawns politely in anticipation. If your eyelids remain courageous long enough to hear about the great kerosene shortage of 1893, feel free to subscribe, though no conductor will check your ticket. In the early years of Victorian rail travel, diners discovered that tea cooled too quickly inside rattling carriages, a predicament noted by a clerk whose handwriting resembled a row of sleeping hedgehogs. His solution was to warm the spoon instead of the teapot, a maneuver so indirect it appealed instantly to committees everywhere. The first official spoon warmer weighed nearly a kilogram and featured a hinged lid shaped like a puffed-up pigeon. It took 7 minutes to reach tea-friendly temperature and, according to one diary entry, whispered little gusts of paraffin perfume. By 1872, the London and North Western Railway issued a circular recommending that every first-class dining table be equipped with one receptacle for the steady encouragement of thermal spoons, wording that made dispatch clerks smile before returning to their ledgers. These squat metal cocoons arrived in velvet-lined crates labeled fragile gastronomic comforts, and porters sometimes used the empty crates as footstools during fog delays. Experimental models appeared with felt feet to dampen the clink against porcelain. Alas, the felt absorbed condensation and developed an odor reminiscent of boiled socks, thus begetting a century-long side conversation about humidity and upholstery that never quite concluded. Somewhere outside Crewe, a pragmatic steward tied lavender sachets around the warmer's feet, inventing fragrance marketing before anyone thought to call it that micro hooks of absurdity, sprouted like cinders from a funnel. An enterprising manufacturer in Birmingham patented the Pocket Prometheus, a miniature spoon warmer no larger than a gooseberry, advertised to anxious travelers as insurance against lukewarm broth. Sales were brisk for 3 months, then collapsed after newspapers reported that the flame charred a passenger's glove during an enthusiastic demonstration. The company quietly rebranded the device as a hand muff dryer, moving it to haberdashery counters where nobody expected. Culinary miracles? Meanwhile, the Midland Railway trialed warmers cast in the shape of Tudor castles, complete with crenellations. Diners found themselves stirring plum pudding with spoons that smelled faintly of solder, while miniature turrets glowed ember red, a festive sight that charmed poets and mystified accountants. Details multiplied the way weeds creep between flagstones. Regulations mandated that the wick be trimmed to exactly 3/4 of an inch to prevent smudges on damask tablecloths. Yet inspectors often forgot their rulers and estimated by thumb, producing a quiet variance across regions. A lecturer from Oxford measured 117 warmers and discovered flames ranging from sprightly to apologetic. He concluded with scholarly caution that spoon temperature correlated inversely with conversational volume. Hotter spoons encouraged quieter sipping. His paper received no awards but was filed under miscellany, where it dozes still, perhaps dreaming of citation. During particularly cold winters, guards pre-warmed entire batches in station kitchens. Passengers stepping aboard at Carlisle described rows of glowing lids like sleepy fireflies, while a journalist compared the scene to a modest galaxy forever orbiting the promise of custard. Administrative memos fluttered through the decades. One requested guidance on whether warmers should bear the company crest or remain humbly blank. The reply, either provided no passenger confuses crest with gravy, left ample room for interpretation. Another recommended cork stoppers to snuff flames before tunnels, to avoid city drafts upsetting ladies' complexions. Trial runs proved the corks squeaked defensively, so engineers painted the stoppers with graphite to produce a more dignified hush. That change inspired a minor scandal when an overzealous hostess polished the graphite away, resurrecting the squeak mid-journey, and circling a bishop into spilling syllabub. Newspapers made gentle sport, calling the incident the ecclesiastical squeak, a headline which, like the sound itself, faded quickly. Soft humor nested in the minutiae. Wartime rationing replaced brass with stamped tin, whose thin walls pinged like distant typewriters whenever the carriage shook. Office workers traveling home on leave said the sound reminded them pleasantly of unfinished correspondence, allowing them to fall asleep without guilt. In France, where dining cars pursued elegance with missionary zeal, spoon warmers were lined. with porcelain inserts. British inspectors visiting in 1946 noted that the inserts cracked if the train braked too suddenly, leading to discreet early morning collections of porcelain confetti. One inspector pocketed shards as souvenirs, later arranging them on his mantelpiece where visitors mistook them for fragments of ancient amphorae. He rarely corrected the assumption, preferring the quiet grandeur of misplaced antiquity. Modernity, of course, crept in on rubber solace. Electric cup warmers appeared, promising thermostatic precision. Yet railway stewards complained of cables snarling like sleepy snakes around chair legs. Trials on the East Coast main line ended when a curious child pulled a plug mid-lunch, plunging the carriage into silence broken only by the resigned sigh of cooling coffee. Passengers voted by informal show of hands to return to spirit lamps. Thus the spoon warmer survived into the age of diesel, burning small blue flames beneath stainless steel lids engraved with health and safety warnings so tiny they resembled decorative dots. A focus group later revealed that 73% of respondents found the dots comfortingly indecipherable, a statistic no marketing executive knew how to deploy. Even today, somewhere between York and Edinburgh, an attendant may strike a match and light a lamp beneath a plump little dome, half expecting nobody to notice. Yet one unhurried traveler will smell the faint paraffin, glance up from a paperback, and wonder how the coffee manages to stay friendly all the way to Darlington. Perhaps they will imagine committees past, measuring wicks, debating felt feet, inventing quiet solutions to problems nobody else considered urgent. And perhaps in that reverie, they will drift into a pleasant drowsiness. Spoon resting warm against saucer, thoughts sliding as smoothly as rails under moonlit telegraph wires. So, we glide to the terminus of our softly glowing topic, the carriage rocking ever so slightly as points switch beneath us. Let the gentle arithmetic of centimeters and candle power lull you. Let every historical footnote slide into line like coaches in a siding, brakes hissing to a contented hush. The final flame gutters, a spoon cools by imperceptible degrees, and the last record of its warmth is a faint ring on linen, drying into nothing at all. Feel that quiet evaporation and allow your own wakefulness to fade likewise, until all that remains is faint memory of a puffed-up pigeon lid and the distant, measured heartbeat of wheels on rail, slowing, almost though not quite at rest, asterisk. You might not expect the distance between two wooden slats on a public bench to reveal the secret hopes of city engineers, yet for more than 130 years, the gentle gap beneath our resting spines has hosted a quiet parliament of draftsmen, varnishers, and squirrels. If you're still awake by the time we reach the Vienna Ordinance of 1924, an edict concerning how much drizzle a pine seat should politely endure, feel free to subscribe. Or let the notion slip through the very same gap, settling beside forgotten sunflower seeds and yesterday's headline. Our stroll begins on an April morning in 1881, inside the tool shed of a Parisian jardinier named Eloy Perrault. He is sanding a plank of chestnut while composing verses in his head, convinced that smooth timber invites couplets as readily as conversation. The city has asked for 12 identical benches along the Allée des Brillards. Eloy's only instruction is that the seated shall not catch their coats. Measuring with a hand-forged dividers, he pencils 4 recurring distances, 3 of them cautious, 1 rather bold, and chooses the bold, a slat spacing of precisely 2 doits, chiefly because his pocket knife happens to be that wide when folded. He never knows his whim will echo across continents, becoming the informal width of comfortable anonymity. Within a decade, postcards bloom with images of courting couples framed by Perrault slats, the gaps drawing lines of sunlight across, skirt hems and boot tips. Romantic slogans appear, love slips between the boards, prompting municipal councils to wonder whether narrower, Gaps might discourage public embrace. Marseille experiments with the one-doit design. Lovers simply sit closer, proving geometry has limits. Meanwhile, engineers in Stuttgart fret that wide spacing accelerates dampness, so they counter with metal mesh inserts painted forest green. The mesh rusts within a season. Stippling trousers with orange freckles, fondly dubbed bench measles by tailors seeking new revenue. Reports of the ailment travel alongside fabric swatches tacked to letters, each swatch sporting a single freckle circled in pencil, like a tiny eclipse. Around 1903, the Office of Parks and Pleasure Grounds in London appoints a committee on seating. Comfort composed of 2 surveyors, 1 botanist, and an elderly clergyman described as fond of sitting. Their first meeting is delayed when the clergyman insists on testing every bench in St. James's Park before pronouncing them satisfactory hosts for piety. He notes the slats facing the lake are cooler by 2 degrees, a discovery attributed to the reflective gloom of water, and recommends adjustable cushions, an idea filed into minutes and never reopened. Instead, the committee settles on a national guideline, 4 fingers breadth per slat gap, enough to drain a shower yet too small for sparrows to soar baguette crumbs. Implementation is voluntary and thus enthusiastically ignored by northern towns where iron founders outnumber botanists. Sheffield responds with a wrought iron bench whose backrest resembles Gothic railings. The slats are mere iron rods, so narrow they squeal against winter coats. The city hails them as indestructible and includes them in its tourist brochure under robust amenities. Micro-hooks of absurdity flourish in the marginalia. In 1911, a catalog from the firm of Holtz and Schweik lists a bench, alpine style, boasting slat gaps calibrated for optimum melt-off of spring snow. The catalog's diagram, rendered in impeccable lithography, labels each void chute de flocon as those snowflakes depart in dignified processions. Salesmen carrying demonstration miniatures traverse Europe. One model survives today in a Tyrol museum, its tiny slats no wider than piano strings and varnished in a color reminiscent of overcooked marmalade. Curators admit nobody recalls why the varnish was chosen, but visitors find its stickiness charming. The accompanying placard claims the bench reduces thaw time for seated mountaineers by 8 minutes, a statistic surely drafted after the second. Schnapps, still, the myth lingers, and by 1914, a Swiss canton requires all new benches to respect the shedding principle. Unsurprisingly, war diverts attention. Shed snow gives way to shed timetables, and slatlore hibernates beneath tarpaulins alongside bandstands and shuttered pavilions. Peace returns in the form of municipal repainting drives. Surplus khaki paint from demobilized depots finds second. Life on park furniture, imparting a martial hush to Sunday strolls. Children chalk hopscotch grids across the drab boards, bridging slat gaps with pastel rainbows that wash away in the first drizzle, yet leave a ghost tint admired by poets short on metaphors. A 1922 letter from the Budapest Garden Society praises khaki as the color of complicated calm. Budapest also experiments with the 5 slats seat, 3 for sitting, 2 below for structural morale, spacing them an exact 4.5 centimeters apart. The decimal pleases accountants but confounds carpenters accustomed to thumbs. One joiner, defiant, planes his spacer stick until it aligns with his thumbnail, thereby converting the metric mandate back into the realm of living flesh. Inspectors measure the finished benches, shrug, and certify them acceptable. Thus, the unofficial unit known as thumb plus tolerance spreads quietly eastward, traveling faster than official decrees ever could. The Viennese Ordinance of 1924, promised earlier, finally arrives via a dusty portfolio tied with scarlet ribbon. It stipulates that any slat wider than 9 centimeters must alternate with a gap no less than 1.8 and no more than 2.2 centimeters, an arithmetic that suggests sleepless. Mates with calipers. The drafter includes a footnote about felt-tipped boots catching on screw heads. Proving legislation occasionally listens to cobblers. Implementation day finds park keepers squinting at rulers while pigeons stroll between their shoes. 2 benches emerge from the exercise measurably compliant, while dozens remain in laissez-faire repose. Nobody distinguishes them in practice because leaves drift onto both with equal indifference. The ordinance nevertheless inspires Prague to compose its own, reducing maximum gap by 0.5 millimeter in a gesture of gentle rivalry. A Prague newspaper cartoons 2 benches, 1 Viennese, 1 Czech bowing to each other while the leaves. Applaud. Historical impact, negligible, but the cartoon is still reprinted every autumn in local papers when nothing urgent sprouts. War again darkens paint. Metal rationing replaces iron braces with beech struts doweled through flaking oak, and slats loosen just enough to creak like hesitant floorboards. Couples courting at dusk blame the creaks on imaginary ghosts to spare themselves the embarrassment of affection-generated noise. After the armistice, councils award contracts to whichever factory boasts the most leftover bolts. Slat spacing becomes collateral geometry, drifting between war surplus pragmatism and peacetime whimsy. In Lyrons, someone proposes translucent bench. Seats poured from surplus perspex. The prototype warps under summer sun, gaps blooming to swallow a counselor's pen between speeches. The idea is politely shelved. Perspex seats consigned to scripts for futuristic theater productions in which, ironically, nobody sits dot by the 1960s. Ergonomics emerges wielding clipboards and earnest vocabularies. Researchers at a Swedish institute determined that optimal backslat spacing should cradle the lower thoracic region like a hesitant handshake. They published diagrams resembling musical staves, each gap annotated with letters familiar only to physiotherapists. Municipal buyers glaze over midway, adopting only the recommendation that front edges be rounded by at least 4 millimeters, preventing what the report calls pressure crescents. Woodturners celebrate the new curve, branding it the Scandinavian. Smile, though in Malt the term quickly shortens to smell a word that, whispered, sounds pleasantly like a breeze between slats. Enter plastic. A French company unveils injection-molded benches sporting ribs instead of slats, promising zero maintenance, eternal color. Early models fade to chalk within 2 summers, their ribs flexing under the weight of modest pigeons. Critics declare wood immortal after all, and oak makes a modest comeback, this time certified by the Forestry Stewardship Council, whose label is stapled under many a seat where only spiders appreciate accreditation. By now, slat spacing has coalesced around a global average of 20 millimeters wide enough for rainfall, narrow enough to discourage most small change from escaping trouser pockets. One engineer notes that a €2 coin will still slip through. Colleagues remark this might be the universe's way of taxing forgetful tourists. The observation becomes a slide in a PowerPoint unspooled at an international street furniture symposium, eliciting drowsy laughter that ripples across rows of stackable chairs designed by someone else. As LED lamps halo twilight. Today's bench sits in parks from Porto to Perth, 9 slats on iron feet shaped vaguely like herons. If you graze your fingers over the surface, you might feel the faint grammar carved by generations of chisels, the courageous two-doit daring of Eloy, the patriotic 0.5 millimeter of Praga, the round-edged Scandinavian smile. You might also feel the ghost indentation of a child's pastel rainbow, or the notch where an umbrella ferrule rested during an unexpected drizzle. Let these gentle irregularities lull you. Imagine each gap inhaling evening air, exhaling the day's small anecdotes, newspapers rustling, shoes pausing, lovers aligning. Hear the miniature sigh of a maple leaf slipping between boards to finish its voyage. Somewhere, a nocturnal gardener sweeps paths by lantern, the bristles choosing not to interfere with the bench's private storytelling. Asterisk. Soon the lamp's glow softens to amber. Dew collects along the uppermost slat until a bead forms, hesitates, and drops through the 20mm gateway to oblivion. Follow that bead downward, past the screws whose slots still whisper about. Felt-tip boots, past the coat buttons that once threatened to snag, into the hushed kingdom beneath where rabbit tracks mingle with ticket stubs, where measurements no longer apply. Stay in that underbench, hush a moment longer than necessary. Feel the descending hush in your own breath, slats above nudging memories into tidy rows. Somewhere a page turns in a book of design standards. Somewhere else, a squirrel leaps from bench to grass, deciding gap tolerances are above its pay grade. And right here, in the generous quiet between one polished board and the next, even wakefulness discovers it can loosen its screws, settle back, and let the night perform its gentle maintenance until everything, including slat, gap, and drifting, thought, aligns in perfect, barely measurable repose. Asterisk. You might not expect the relative humidity inside a modest envelope factory in Liege to change the cadence of love letters across half the planet. Yet here we are, lingering over the unimaginative shimmer of wheat starch glue. If you're still awake by the time we reach the 1962 Saliva Viscosity Accord, feel free to subscribe though, like a half-licked stamp. The gesture is perfectly content to wait. It begins in the spring of 1874, when a junior clerk at the Belgian Post noticed that envelope sealed faster on foggy mornings, producing a softer rip as he tested each flap for quality. He recorded the observation in a margin, moist days kinder to letters. Less paper screaming, then carried on, blissfully unaware that a decade later entire research committees would swirl around that same note like tea around a porcelain rim. The early envelope glues were brewed in copper kettles, a smell somewhere between porridge and old window putty. Workers stirred with oar-sized paddles, striking a tempo that echoed down timber rafters and guided pigeons to roost above the vats, as though the birds mistook the glue's steam for marshland. One shift foreman, proud of his steady wrists, claimed he could tell by pitch alone when the starch reached the sighing stage, ideal for quick-bound envelopes. His colleagues nodded, half believing, half dreaming of coffee breaks. Orders from Paris demanded flaps that sealed with a single polite lick. Berlin preferred 2 licks for psychological reassurance, weighing trust by tongue. Thus were born the first unofficial hardness grades S1 for single lick, S2 for double neatly penciled onto shipping crates and absolutely nowhere else. Across the channel, London stationers confronted a different puzzle. Winter coal smoke dried the air, starving glue of cooperative moisture. An experimental batch was laced with glycerin to retain dewiness, but the additive left a faintly sweet aftertaste that clerks found distracting. One wrote that the envelopes seemed to flirt with the palate, making mundane invoices feel indecently personal. To dampen enthusiasm, suppliers reduced glycerin by half, only to discover tongues now stuck to flaps with comic dedication. For several weeks, office corridors echoed with the muffled yelps of junior staff caught in adhesive limbo, tearing themselves free like startled geckos. Managers issued handkerchiefs pre-dampened with distilled water. The fabric squares cooled, cheeks and reputation simultaneously, and were laundered each Friday with starchy formality. Farther afield, humidity played its quiet trickery. In Singapore, monsoon air rendered S2 envelopes positively giddy. They sealed upon merely thinking damp thoughts. Postal clerks waved flaps above their heads for ventilation, performing improvised fan dances amid sacks of airmail. Reports reached headquarters describing self-possessed stationery, prompting a memorandum that recommended a coarser starch, less eager to commit. Meanwhile, in the high deserts of New Mexico, Ranchers complained that even 3 determined licks left corners sulking open like reluctant shutters. A traveling salesman in Albuquerque began hawking pocket atomisers' tiny brass pumps that misted envelopes with rosewater. The scent lingered through sorting offices, and for a brief season, the American Southwest smelled faintly of dusty valentines addressed to nobody in particular. These regional tangles finally drew notice at the 1909 Congress of Universal Posts in Rome, where delegates arrived armed with anecdote and chapped lips. The Belgian clerk's margin note, now decades old, resurfaced in the agenda under the grand title Preliminary Reflection on Hygroscopic Influences. After a dinner of artichokes and diplomatic small talk, the assembly filed into a hall whose frescoed angels appeared to eavesdrop. They listened to papers with titles like Capillarity and Courtesy and The Blush of Paper in Tropical Climates, each delivered in a voice slow enough to lull translation booths into near hibernation. Micro Hooks kept dozing minimal. A Russian expert confessed he'd once sealed a census return with beetroot juice when water ran out on a train. Laughter rose, gentle as steam. A British baronet suggested envelopes be issued with miniature blotters for the discreet dry-tongued, sparking murmur of approval from those nursing brandy hangovers. No votes were taken. The matter, like half-closed flaps, was left pending. During the lull of the interwar years, chemistry advanced with the quiet persistence of ivy. Laboratories in Basel produced polyvinyl emulsions promising instant tack, while French poets mourned the passing of the eloquent pause between lick and press. To reconcile romance and efficiency, a Swiss engineer proposed flavor neutral. Gum combined with a hygrometer ink stamp. Press the stamp to the flap. If the imprint turned blue, humidity sufficed for sealing sans saliva. Trials revealed the ink bled through envelopes, printing melancholy blue halos on enclosed birthday cards, a spectral effect displeasing to grandmothers. The project retired to a filing cabinet labeled Inventions Awaiting Temperate Futures, where it rests alongside a cork-lined letter opener and a heated wax scrum scraper no one remembers ordering. World War II complicated tongues, rationing, and glue alike. Potato starch replaced wheat. Some batches harbored a faint earthy scent. Leading American G is to joke they were licking Idaho. And Black Market Vienna, a resourceful typist mixed envelope gum from boiled rice and pocketed ration tickets by selling jars labeled post pudding. Her concoction worked but attracted weevils, encouraging correspondents to hurry their letters lest the flaps host midnight dinners. Somewhere in a cellar ledger, an auditor noted spoilage due to nibbling, then doodled a tiny bug waving. A flag evidence that, even in shortage, humor survived in pencil margins, which leads drowsily to the 1962 Saliva Viscosity Accord convened in Reykjavik, chosen for its admirably average relative humidity. Delegates packed thermoses of home. Tap water for tasting calibration, a gesture politely ignored by customs. Over 2 days, they swirled beakers of distilled spit substitutes. RATING glide, cling, and aftertaste with the seriousness usually reserved for string quartets. A consensus emerged. The ideal envelope required only 0.12 milliliters of moisture to adhere within 3 seconds under 60% humidity. The resulting specification, NXB12, circulated the globe, printed on paper so thin the text showed through both sides like an impatient echo. Manufacturers adjusted formulas. Stationery. Catalogs bragged B12 compliant, in fonts taller than necessary. Yet the public scarcely noticed coats still drizzled, stamps still croaked, and lovers still overlicked just to be sure. Electronic mail might have sealed history's envelope were it not for ritual. That sticky residue of habit, even into the 1990s. Greeting card aisles whispered with the sound of cautious testing, index fingers moistened on lips, tapping flaps to gauge pre-gummed enthusiasm. Marketing teams added peel and seal strips to protect lipstick. They said, but surveys showed most buyers peeled, but instinctively licked anyway, sheepish as cats caught grooming air. A Japanese stationery firm released nostalgia gum, scented faintly with library bindings. Sales spiked during exam season as students sought the calming aroma of overdue textbooks. One blogger described the scent as confidence lightly toasted. A review reprinted on packaging until no one believed it was accidental. Today, a letter still begins its journey the moment moisture kisses gum. Somewhere a sorting machine glints. Under fluorescent calm, scanning barcodes never dreamed by Eloise of the benches or the Persian clerk of quiet glue. Yet in that instant before pressure bonds fiber to fiber, the flap hesitates, inviting one last breath of room temperature air, one last chance for drizzle, one last nod to the parliament of draftsmen, varnishers, squirrels, and statisticians. Attend fatigue. Envision that narrow pause, feel it widen just enough to cradle your lingering thoughts, then close soft, sure, restful. And as the envelope joins its stack, let your eyelids perform a similar fold, sealing day's chatter behind them with precisely the moisture NXB12 declared sufficient, drifting toward sleep on a draft measured only by how quietly the next page turns. You might not expect the precise spiral of a brass garden hose thread 11.5 turns per inch, not a fraction more to have soothed generations of municipal clerks into approving summer budgets. Yet this tiny helix has been winding through public paperwork since long before most hedgerows learned the difference between drought and drizzle. Should your days remain stubbornly open by the time I describe the 1928 hand-tight standard that insisted hose couplings ought to seal with only 2 gentle twists, feel free to subscribe, or simply imagine a distant sprinkler applauding you with faint applause. Either path is perfectly acceptable to the Ministry of Mild Hydraulics, whose archives inspired tonight's leisurely wander down the dripping lane of hosepipe. History. Ramble begins in 1863, when a tinsmith named Silas Grigg, fresh from polishing church lanterns in Worcester, received an urgent request. The town nursery wished to avoid hauling buckets all the way to its infant rhododendrons. Silas adopted an out-of-print screw thread from a chandelier's wick adjuster 11 threads per inch, incidentally, and stretched it onto a 2-inch coupling he brazed after supper. Nobody yet called this improvised twirl a garden hose. Standard. It simply fit the only spanner Silas owned, which also opened his cider barrel. Nevertheless, the coupling behaved agreeably, allowing the nursery's constable-turned-gardener to water seedlings while singing off-key psalms at a tempo perfectly matched to the new thread's leisurely flow. News seeped outward as water tends to do. Within a decade, 3 English foundries were casting Grigg-style ends, now tweaked to that fateful 11.5 turns, because a foreman believed half a thread discouraged cross-graining and encouraged patience. London merchants applauded the half-thread as genteel restraint, while Birmingham catalogs claimed it reduced elbow fatigue by 7%, a figure they reached by timing how long it took an apprentice to complain. Continental plumbers sniffed at such British fussing and kept their metric fittings, only to discover tourists bringing hose nozzles from holiday and begging them to fit tap adapters, just for the roses, you know. Thus by osmosis, rather than treaty, the spiral crossed borders like a bored dog wandering through open gates. Wherever the fitting arrived, micro-hooks sprouted like crabgrass. In Verona, a marble yard rigged hose to cool stone slabs before chiseling. Sculptors whispered that a slower thread preserved the echo inside the block, making angels easier to coax from veined Carrara. In Rotterdam, tulip farmers insisted the half-thread allowed petals to open a moment earlier at dawn, statistically unproven yet fiercely defended during lunch breaks. Meanwhile, an Iowa hardware store promoted courtship couplings to matching ends sold in satin pouches, claiming Young couples who practice joint hose attachment divorce 16% less often. A local pastor tried verifying the statistic by surveying parishioners. The forms returned blank except for doodles of coiled snakes, suggesting either irreverence or deep contemplation. By 1905, railway depots were drowning in wooden crates branded GH 11.5, their stencils blurred by rain that British dispatchers called permissible damp. The United States Bureau of Standards, irritated by metric whispers, dispatched an earnest young engineer named Minerva Tuttle to catalog every garden thread in use. Her notebook remains a triumph of sleepy enumeration. No, 387 fits snug. Smells faintly of linseed. No, 388 threads too eager require calming. Minerva concluded that Greg's helix, though unheroic, best balanced drip and drag. Therefore, she recommended federal adoption for civilian horticulture and any military endeavor involving peonies. Congress tabled the report, but ironmonger flyers embraced it overnight, reprinting her phrase about peonies because it sounded almost strategic. The First World War requisitioned copper, forcing hosemakers toward galvanized iron that rusted at a sigh. Soldiers in training camps twisted couplings so often that drill sergeants incorporated the motion into calisthenics. Left, right, tighten, breathe. Diaries mention the comforting scrape of thread on thread beneath moonlit tents, sometimes likened to locusts mumbling in the grass. After Armistice, surplus fittings flooded Victory Garden kits, and Aunt Mildred from Shropshire discovered she could water beans with equipment once destined for the Marne, a fact she noted upon labels of homemade jam, raspberry, irrigated. In peace, between wars, inventors chased the perfect gasket. Cork washers swelled like pastry in summer. Leather smelled too nostalgically of saddles. Finally, black rubber triumphed, though not before a chemist in Lyon introduced lavender-scented rings that made water briefly fragrant. Newspapers hailed aromatic irrigation, yet bees mistook perfumed mist for blooming fields and bombarded. Laundry lines, so councils quietly returned to plain rubber. Still, one might occasionally meet a washer faintly redolent of lavender in antique trunks, like a recollection that forgot where it was headed but packed scent for the journey. Then came 1928, and the hand-tight Standard Conference convened in a Brighton ballroom whose ceiling still remembered maritime waltzes. Delegates placed brass couplings upon plush doilies and timed each other turning threads until drip ceased. After countless cups of weak tea, they decreed that 2 complete rotations, no more, no less, should achieve a seal on hoses up to 60 feet, provided the user possessed neither undue haste nor theatrical languor. The phrase strolled into instruction leaflets worldwide, charming proofreaders who otherwise endured paragraphs about hose bib numbers. The standard specified torque measurable by the comfortable pinch of forefinger and thumb, thereby elevating human quietude to legal statute. Critics called it whimsical, supporters called it human-centered. Evening crept in, applauded both sides, and blew out the candles. World War II rationing trimmed brass to the bone. Civilians lined up for Bakelite connectors advertised as Victory Thread, though Bakelite cracked if stared at sternly. Housewives kept spare pieces in biscuit tins labeled fragile, not a biscuit. Soldiers abroad, longing for garden calm, wrote home asking for used couplings to mash into trench lighters. Museums still own lighters patterned with 11.5 wobbles, preserving the ghost of hose inside a cigarette spark. Peace returned alongside aluminum, light as unsolicited advice. The half-thread survived by lodging its dimensions inside early computer. Punch cards that scheduled water treatment pumps. Programmers, entranced by repetitive numbers, nicknamed the code Hosey, which happily escaped maintenance audits until COBOL replaced its last sleepy loop. The 1970s flirted with snap-fit plastics, promising liberation from rotation. Advertisers showed gardeners clicking pieces with disco certainty, yet a quiet faction missed the meditative twirl, the small spiral of pause before spray. The California Cooperative printed bumper stickers, "I turn, therefore I hose," they mailed. One to every legislator. None replied, but several were later spotted on briefcases at irrigation hearings, suggesting unspoken solidarity. Research papers measured user pulse training threads lowered, heart rate by 3 beats per minute compared with snap fits, and coined the term helical serenity response, a phrase more soothing than any actual conclusion. Today, somewhere between sunrise and insomnia, a gardener kneels beside a tap, fingers finding that first gentle bite of thread before the rest follows like a lullaby in metal. 11.5 turns per inch guide water toward tomatoes that do not appreciate the arithmetic, yet thrive regardless. Each rotation is the echo of Silas Grigg's pocket knife, of Minerva Tuttle's calm narration, of Brighton delegates timing unhurried thumbs. Imagine their collective patience spiraling forward, threading through your own thoughts until they snugly seal. A faint hiss signals pressure held, conversation hushed. Droplets gather at the nozzle's tip like children about to slip down a slide, then launch into twilight air where crickets tune their bows. If consciousness still glimmers, picture one brass coupling unscrewed at dusk, droplets ticking from male to female and tiny, measured goodnights. Hear the click of rubber washer, settling back into its circles. Smell the shy rust of iron spade nearby. Feel the lucid calm of water waiting for tomorrow. And as the hose loops itself on a hook, shaped like a drowsy swan, let your own thoughts coil, half thread longer than needed, just enough for safety, just enough to hold sleep against the small listening leaks of night. You may not expect the unhurried wobble of a thin paper ribbon unspooling from an under-counter reel to have directed so many civic compromises. Yet the tale of how receipt rolls agreed upon their understated width 42 modest millimeters. Give or take an apologetic fraction has drifted through shopfront ledgers and municipal tenders for over a century. If your eyes remain set to daylight savings, long enough to hear about the Rotterdam Consensus of 1957, feel free to subscribe. Otherwise, let the faint rustle of carbonless copy layers settle over you like evening dust on a closed bookshop. Door. Our slow reveal begins on a drizzly Wednesday in 1892, in the back room of Meyer and Sons Haberdashery, Leipzig, where young Otto Meyer is assembling a newly imported cash register rumored to ring more politely than previous models. He discovers needle already threaded to mend a jammed carriage, that the receipt strip shipped with the brass machine is barely an inch wide, narrower than the ribbon on his aunt's reading spectacles. Bemused, he trims a longer local roll, down to match, telling himself width is surely no matter so long as prices behave. Daylight fades. The machine rings once, perhaps twice. Otto's decision, scribbled without thought in the margins of a supplier's invoice, will echo into every queue that ever shifted its weight from one foot to the other. Within 3 seasons, Leipzig wholesalers supplying identical machines request narrower paper by default because the internal spindle refuses to entertain generous rolls. Papermakers oblige, slicing broad sheets into new slivers they nickname Klingstreifen, clink. Strips after the cash bell's shy chime. Invoices flutter outward, bearing tidy columns conscripted into that slim format. Numbers lean left like drowsy soldiers in a single-file march. Com is wondering why they suddenly feel weightless. Meanwhile, in Budapest, a rival register arrives. With a spindle exactly 5 millimeters wider, engineered by a machinist who misread a blueprint dimension blurred by coffee grounds. His customers praise the extra room for flourishes. A perfumer writes "thank you kindly" under each total, looping the Y in a scented flourish that would never have survived Otto's austerity. Thus begins the gentle schism of receipt widths too, slight for headlines, yet large enough to power polite grumbling across. Europe's counting house corridors dot microhooks sprout like breadcrumbs. A French confectioner in Dijon complains that sugar dust clogs his register gears, so the local stationer laminates the paper core with beeswax. The roll, fractionally thicker, forces the shopgirl to tug harder, tearing off stubs shaped like reluctant postage stamps. Customers pocket these sugary curls as bookmarks, later mailing them to cousins as curiosite, thereby spreading gossip of sweetly scented receipts, though not a single cousin remembers the price of nougat printed upon them. Across the channel, English drapers adopt a heavy linen bond touted as impervious to drizzle. The bond resists ink at first, encouraging clerks to double-strike figures, so totals appear shadowed as though accompanied by nervous echoes. Shoppers file them in purses where the digits softly smudge into mothwing whispers. Proving imperviousness has its own sense of humor. You can almost hear the Parliament of Dimensions gathering. In 1910, the Swiss Federal Office for Weights and Measures convenes an informal tea to discuss retail thermal paper of carriage width not exceeding 45 millimeters, blissfully unaware that thermal chemistry still sleeps 30 years ahead. Their minutes. Ponder whether narrower rolls reduce waste or merely encourage small handwriting in existential doubt that adjourns unresolved, accompanied by applause for the fruitcake. Yet the idea of national harmony plants itself like mint in a neglected gutter, spreading quietly under bureaucratic sun. By 1921, Vienna's Guild of Paper Cutters proposes 40 millimeters as austere yet adequate. Prague counters with 43 millimeters, citing Slavic numeral breadth. German delegates split the difference at 42 millimeters, arguing the integer has philosophical charm, neither the vanity of a round number nor the suspicion of a prime. The proposal dozes in carbon copy until awakenings of war. Postpone everything except appetite. During rationing, paper mills stretch pulp like strudel dough. Wartime receipts emerge translucent enough to see tomorrow's ration stamps through them. Clerks adopt abbreviated decimals. 05 becomes simply 5 to save ink, giving the impression every price begins mid-thought. Still the stubborn spindle. Dimensions remain. Machines must feed, like watchful pets, even as shelves thin. Soldiers write love notes on verso sides of receipts because stationery costs coupons. The width proves strangely intimate, forcing declarations into haiku-ish brevity. Somewhere in Belgium, a lieutenant proposes on 3 joined stubs. G timbras, plus long chiachechi. The slips survive folded in a locket now displayed behind subdued glass in a provincial museum where the docent rarely dusts because visitors finding the case are already whisper quiet. Peace finds economies giddy for standardization. Register manufacturers send shiny prototypes to 1948's trade fair in Milan, promising universal roll accommodation. Observers notice all spindles look suspiciously shaped for 42 millimeters. When asked, an engineer shrugs. Wider is vanity, narrower is cruelty. The phrase lands in trade journals, quoted between adverts for perforation blades and inked ribbon reels. Still, America, ever confident in its own decimals, flirts with an inch and 3/4. Roll when diners demand longer tip calculations. Midwest mechanics install brass shims so European rolls fit Yankee spindles. A transatlantic compromise enacted in Greece, unseen, unsung, yet endlessly utilised.now. The Rotterdam Consensus of 1957. Promise earlier glides in on a foghorns. Representatives from paper mills, register firms, and 2 umbrella repairmen, nobody remembers why they were invited, gather in a dockside canteen whose tablecloth bears a tomato soup constellation. They measure sample rolls with calipers still, smelling of herring brine, muttering that 42 millimeters aligns. gracefully with both metric rulers and inch fractions, 1.654, though nobody speaks that decimal aloud for fear of conjuring fractions at supper. After a single vote yeas muffled by drizzle, they draft a guideline. Core diameter shall be 12.7 millimeters. Outer diameter no greater than a petite apple, and width exactly 42 millimeters, except when local romance dictates otherwise. The footnote about romance passes unchallenged, possibly because the umbrella men, eyes misting, assure everyone rain makes lovers generous tippers. Manufacturers worldwide adopt the width with sleepy enthusiasm, chiseling dies, honing blades, stamping cartons that read RC42 in fonts tired yet content. In Tokyo, automated packing arms embrace the measurement. Rolls now ship aligned like choir boys, their edges burnished to a polite hush. Grocery stores install spindle-less drop bays. Paper tongues feed themselves, curving outward on chrome lips before surrendering to cashier tears. An Oxford mathematician times the curl, 2.5 seconds from tug to tear, a rhythm he claims ideal for reciting the number 7 in Greek. His letter 2. Nature is politely declined, but pinned on the staff bulletin board of W.H. Smith, where a bored Saturday assistant copies the timing to impress customers, thus perpetuating the myth that efficient service echoes Homeric cadence. Microhooks persist. In 1974, petroleum shortages squeeze chemical coatings. Receipts briefly fade, in sunlight like shy ghosts. Shoppers squint at blank strips, convinced totals were lower a minute prior. Researchers add leuco dyes that darken under gentle heat. Children discover a coin rubbed edgewise reveals secret gradients, turning purchases into accidental treasure maps. Urban legends bloom. A baker claims folded receipts predict whether ink blots widen before storms. The meteorological office responds with a pamphlet warning correlation is not forecast. Pamphlets, printed on white-a-four, curl ironically in bakery. Windows beside narrow prophetic rolls dot by the 1990s. Laser scanning tells bloom red light across barcodes. Printer heads whisper instead of chug, yet the feed path retains its ancestral width. Hardware engineers argue a new dimension risks legacy outage. Software teams nod, preferring to debug elsewhere. Eco-advocates lobby for skip printing. Buttons, retailers sigh that customers still crave physical proof to reconcile purse arithmetic. So printers shrink margins, instead text creeps ever nearer the edges like early frost on a windscreen. Amid those margins, designers slip cheerful. Icons, smiley faces thanking patrons, tiny recycling emblems, occasional fortunes. In Reykjavik, a cafe prints random Icelandic idioms, Sassem fleitirsir way aldrei tíma to amuse tourists, though translations rarely fit the line and overflow like warm milk onto barista shoes. Today, somewhere under fluorescent calm, a kiosk spits 42 millimeters of thermal certainty. Date, time, cryptic skew. You may watch it emerge, curl with capillary nostalgia, and realize this curl is precisely the arc. Muse of the tableau, measured in 1949 when she doodled logarithmic spirals beside her ledger. You may roll the slip between finger and thumb, feeling the hush of countless committee evenings, ration boards, and umbrella men who believed rain should shape policy. Hold it to your ear, nobody is watching, and hear a faint hiss of dye meeting. Heat like distant applause restrained by ushers. Ink darkens, subtotal lines beneath novelties. Did the paper choose 42 because it answered cosmic riddles, or because Otto's pocket knife was conveniently wide? Perhaps both or neither, drifting together the way numbers join without asking whether they were invited. Permit the strip to fall, featherlight, into bag or pocket, its curl settling against keys and lint. Imagine it later forgotten atop a dresser, relax into the certainty that sunlight will fade the letters by morning. Totals dissolve. Only the width endures. A small corridor of blank potential rolled out for moths to promenade and for your mind to amble, toes brushing each side like sleepy tourists on a narrow bridge. Let the bridge guide you now. Step onto 42 millimeters of soothed arithmetic. Feel the board steady beneath each breath. Lean over the rail and watch careless decimals drift downstream into oblivion. When you step off the far end, may it be into a dream so pleasantly itemized that even the tax lines whisper goodnight, and the curl of paper tucks itself around your thoughts with the exact discretion generations once measured, debated, standardized, and finally left quietly unquestioned. You might not expect the length of a single telephone. Ring 2 seconds of brass bell clang, followed by 4 seconds of hush to have choreographed dawn across thousands of indistinguishable hotel corridors, yet for more than 100 years. This humble pulse of copper and quiet has coaxed travelers from half-dreams into neck stretches, meeting agendas and buffet queues. If your eyelids remain heroic long enough to hear about the Montreal comparison trials of 1954, feel free to subscribe. Otherwise, let the ringing drift into the hallway, where patterned carpet can absorb any promise you forget by breakfast. Our story opens on a drizzly Tuesday in 1898 in room 17 of the Grand Atlantic boarding house, Brighton. Mrs. Eunice Caldwell, night clerk and amateur watercolorist, is winding the spring of a new electromechanical annunciator, a wall-mounted box whose hammer strikes a fat brass cup whenever she flips a switch at the front desk. The salesman guaranteed it would wake railway conductors with polite insistence, a phrase Eunice repeats under her breath as she counts the seconds between strikes. 2 seems courteous, 3 feels abrupt. She files the observation on a scrap of water that will quite accidentally steer the rhythms of industrial slumber for generations. Within a season, boarding houses from Blackpool to Bath order similar contraptions, each timed by whatever pocket watch the installer trusts. Most. Some rings last the entire breath of a candle flame. Others merely hiccup. Guests complain of jolts or oversleeps, so proprietors begin swapping timing diagrams like pie recipes. A consensus wobbles toward Eunice's 2-on-4 cadence sound. Bright enough to rattle coat hangers, pause long enough for a heartbeat of denial, then repeat until conscience sits up. Hardware catalogs dub it the seaside interval, implying gull cries and salted breezes, though most bells echo against. Wallpaper smelling faintly of boiled linen. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, New York hotels favor 3-second blares, separated by 3-second rests, an arrangement that syncopates with elevator clunks and makes European visitors think of tugboats. Thus 2 empires of ringing grow in. Parallel, neither dramatic enough for newspapers, yet perfectly suited to tease nerves at dawn. Microhooks sprout like lobby ferns. In Kansas City, a night porter discovers that sliding a thimble over the hammer softens the attack just enough to leave dream fragments intact. Traveling salesmen praise the invention and tip with shiny dimes. In Marseille, a concierge wraps felt around the bell cup. Seafarers oversleep, citing cloudy timbre. One captain misses tide by half an hour, writes a stern letter, and felt is banned within a radius of the old port. A Glasgow engineer, determined to quantify courtesy, RIGs a phonograph horn to record guests' grumbles through bedroom transoms. His log correlates muttered curses with ring durations of 2.6 seconds or longer, concluding that every 10th of a second beyond Eunice's ideal adds 1 expletive to the dawn chorus. The paper is rejected by the Royal Society but photocopied endlessly among bell foundries, where apprentices joke that they are really minting adjectives. Then comes electricity hungry for uniformity. In 1923, the Western Electric Company releases the Viva Wakemaster, powered by mains and governed by a rotating cam, whose lobes permit exactly 2 seconds of current for ring, 4 for rest. Hotels in Chicago adopt it overnight. Clerks brag they can set 100 calls in the time it once took to brew chicory coffee. Competitors counter with cam plates offering continental 6-second charm, but repairmen grumble the extra lobes clog with dust. So by 1931, the 2-on-4 pattern rules from Milwaukee to Malaga. An Odessa inn keeps the old single blast. Wooden box for nostalgia. Guests describe the sound as a door knocker wielded by a disappointed aunt. Even their travel diaries, though, note they awoke before the third strike data the new regime claims as vindication. War shifts priorities. Copper is precious, so bell cups shrink. Tone climbs in pitch until it rings like porcelain teaspoons colliding. Soldiers on leave complain they dream of shell wine, so hotels line bells with surplus bakelite, lowering the note to a bureaucratic thunk. Paper rationing shortens message slips. Clerks learn to encode times in 2 digits, so 7 means 7 a.m. 23.3 means 6:30 because the carbon ribbon skipped, a confusion that accidentally standardized the 24-hour clock in hotel basements years. Before railway stations caught up, amid shortages, the Cambridge Institute of Acoustic Hygiene conducts secret tests on minimum rouse amplitude. Volunteers, mostly postgraduates, paid in cocoa powder sleep in bunk beds, beneath ceiling bells, while technicians tweak voltage. Findings: 74 decibels suffices when pause exceeds 4 seconds. Anything louder courts headaches and, intriguingly, vivid dreams of farm animals. Results are stamped confidential and forgotten inside a tea chest that later serves as prop in an amateur pantomime of King Lear, making the research both obscure and culturally versatile. Peace returns, budgets bloom. Montreal's Dominion Bell convenes the 1954 comparison trials promised earlier. Sponsors ship 138 bell assemblies to a downtown hotel, otherwise famous for maple glazed donuts. Over 5 nights, 60 volunteers, sales reps, lured by complimentary shoe shines, rotate through rooms, rating wake-ups on cards pre-sprinkled with talcum against smudging. Datasheets smell like barbershop nostalgia. Results confirmed 2-on-4. Remains subjectively civil, though a minority prefer 1.8 seconds of ring paired with 5 seconds of silence, citing dream completeness. The committee, weary of decimals before breakfast, files the minority opinion under optional grace. Period. Manufacturers quote only the main finding. 2-4 pattern achieves 87% immediate sit-up compliance. Printing it on glossy brochures next to drawings of cheerful sunbeams. Thus the standard leaves Montreal, stamped into relay wheels crossing. Oceans in wooden crates, cushioned by shredded hockey schedules. Technology miniaturizes. The bell retreats behind plastic louvers, now a recording of itself produced by a chip from Taiwan. Yet the waveform still allocates 2 seconds to sound for to hush, honoring Eunice without citation. Digital consoles flash appointment icons. Guests wander halls holding paper cups of drip coffee brewed to hide time zone sorrow. Some hotels add courtesy follow-up calls 5 minutes later, but studies show the second ring nearly startles toothbrushes mid-stroke. Eco-initiatives urge mindful wake-ups, softer tones graduated over 90 seconds, like sunrise in acoustic form. Tests find business travelers disable the feature, fearing they will interpret birdsong as hold music. Meanwhile, boutique inns in Helsinki replace bells with recorded librarians whispering "good morning" in Swedish. Reviews describe the effect as oddly parental, and occupancy stabilizes at pleasantly mediocre numbers. Even now, somewhere under hallway sconce light, a night auditor in sensible shoes taps 0645 into a console. Behind drywall, a relay closes. Current flows through coil. A hammer drawn by magnet hits a cup spun thin as autumn promise. 2 seconds of tone glide beneath doors, painted eggshell quiet, followed by 4 seconds of nothing deep enough to stack. A final dream upon. The cycle repeats until a finger, groggy yet grateful, lifts a handset, murmurs something halfway between hello and enough, and resets the room to silent potential. In that hush, the numbers in the ledger align, just as Eunice's blotter scrap once aligned seconds and civility. Think of her ink now faded to ghost gray, yet the measure persists, ringing human schedules together with more forgiveness than alarm clocks, more certainty than sunlight through drapes. Allow your thoughts to follow the sound's lingering decay. Down carpeted stairs to the lobby where polished brass key fobs gently bump the counter, marking time in softer increments. Hear the last overtones settle like dust on velvet ropes. Feel the 6-second breath invite your own. 2 seconds of memory, 4 of forgetting. Again and again until your mind, satisfied the call has been placed and bell duly answered, checks out of wakefulness, leaving behind only an unclaimed umbrella, a faint echo in bare copper, and a dawn that will proceed, whether or not you witness its precise, courteous arrival. You might not expect the bland tan of an ordinary rubber band, particularly with size, ominously catalogued as number 32, to have choreographed ledger books, mailbags, and hastily packed picnic cutlery for more than 100 quiet years, yet this humble loop of creaking latex has stretched across desks, budgets, and eras with the relaxed stubbornness of a cat refusing to leave sunny windowsills. If you're still awake by the time we reach the 1947 Elastic Quorum that tried to define exactly how many times a band should twang before surrendering to brittleness, feel free to subscribe, or simply let the thought expand and contract beside you until it slips away. Under the bed, like every other stray loop in history, the tale begins in 1889 in a back room of the Liverpool Gutter Works, where apprentice turner Claude Appleby is trimming excess flash from sheets of imported Amazonian rubber. The factory's new bookkeeping department has requested narrow strips for bundling invoice sets. Must embrace 25 sheets firmly but without possessiveness. The memo reads, sounding more like advice about courtship than stationery. Claude selects a strip 3.5 inches long when laid flat, 1/8 of an inch wide, not too eager intention. The choice is whimsical. That's the span from his thumb tip to first knuckle. Nevertheless, bundles behave. Ledgers look suddenly disciplined, like children lining up after recess, and the foreman orders 1,000 more in the Appleby cut. No one predicts this dimension will end up looped around everything from asparagus to airplane engine manuals, but dimensions have a fondness for immortality when they masquerade as afterthoughts. Word slithers outward. By 1902, seaside post offices prefer Appleby loops for tying telegram sheaves, praising their knack for snapping back without splintering wax-sealed corners. London bankers embrace them next, because crimson silk ribbon, the traditional binder of ledgers, collects ink and gossip in equal measure. Beige rubber, by contrast, looks heroically indifferent. Microhooks sprout like dandelions. A grocer discovers the same loop fits over half-pound cheddar wedges, eliminating daily twine. A music hall prop master threads 2 bands together to catapult confetti accidentally, inventing the back row tickle and earning mild applause. A Paris milliner imports a crate of loops, thinking them avant-garde hat adornments. Models complain the sulfur scent overpowers perfume, so the bands retire to a drawer, where they live out decades curled like sleeping snails around unpaid invoices. Manufacturers quietly canonicalize the size as 32, because shipping clerks dislike decimals and the digits look sturdy on crate ends. Competitors debate color. Natural latex dries buttermilk pale, somewhere between straw and shy burlap. One Chicago firm dyes its loops marigold, claiming improved desk visibility. Users protest the cheerful hue stains fingers during humid summers, giving clerks jaundiced thumbs. The experiment ends, leaving only a few novelty loops preserved in shadow boxes at the National Postal Museum, their orange fading to the shade of tired marmalade. Beige remains uncontested, earning nicknames Blonde Spaghetti, Sleepy Halo, Accounts, Hello, none of which appear in catalogs but drift through breakroom folklore. The First World. War diverts latex toward tires and medical tubing. Rubber band quotas tighten like, well, rubber bands. Office managers issue memos instructing staff to retain and reuse elastic connectors until visible cracks exceed 3 in number. Staff obey in spirit, occasionally knitting weary bands. Into makeshift stress balls. One typist at the War Office fashions a chain 50 loops long, drapes it around her neck as a necklace, and is reprimanded for frivolity before being thanked for thrift. Meanwhile, chemists explore vulcanization, tweaks aiming for bands that tolerate damp trenches and hot attics alike. Their experiments yield formulas of almost poetical modesty: 2% sulfur, 0.3% zinc oxide, a whisper of stearic acid, yet these shy proportions defend elasticity better than stirring speeches. Peace arrives, carrying the crisp smell of new stationery. In 1924, the British Standards Institution circulates draft BS 821, spec for rings, rubber, office, misc. The draft recommends the Appleby dimension as Class B, general purpose, leaving smaller Class A for postage stamp bundles and grander Class C for files thick with municipal regrets. During public comment, an elderly solicitor argues Class B should be renamed the Gentleman's Loop. His notice filed, chuckled over, and politely ignored. Still, the draft's tolerances plus or minus 1/8 inch in lay flat length, 1-60-4th in width settle like soft dust. Factories realign die cutters. Beige loops pour forth in perfect anonymity, nesting in cardboard cartons that smell faintly of pencil shavings and Atlantic cargo holds. Enter microhook era 2. Aviation, mechanics at Croydon Airfield slip size 32 loops over threaded sleeves. While labeling spark plug sets, marveling that latex shrugs off oil droplet insults. Pilots pocket loops to keep chocolate rations tidy. One band carries a scraggly note across the channel, survives 2 landings, and ends up framed beside propeller. Shards at a reunion dinner, toasted with warm stout. On the ground, shopkeepers begin recycling loops onto returned bottles. Customers attach coins for doorstep milk deliveries, trusting the elastic handshake between dairyman and homemaker. Sociologists later cite this practice as trust secured by modest tension, though the footnote is lost in a journal that ceases publication for lack of controversy. World War II reignites rationing. Synthetic Buna joins natural latex, imparting a gray undertone but preserving bounce. School children collect tired bands for salvage drives. Posters depict heroic loops corralling enemy documents. One patriotic cartoon shows a band lassoing a cannon muzzle, anatomically unlikely yet morally uplifting. After victory, bands spill again into civil life, a gentle restoration signaled by the pluck of mailroom catapults. Office folklore now claims a drop band landing in perfect figure-8 formation grants its finder one wish, provided the wish concerns stationary promotion and is whispered before anyone steps on the loop. Statisticians test the superstition, find no correlation, publish anyway in a footnote because funding insists upon deliverables. Which brings us, yawningly, to the 1947 Elastic Quorum in Newark, New Jersey. Convened by 6 manufacturers and 2 large customers, the U.S. Census Bureau, and Woolworth's central office, both drowning in paperwork tides. Participants arrange benches in a semicircle, place loops on a velvet runner, and stretch them while pocket watches tick. Debate focuses on how many extension cycles of pulling to twice length and release constitute serviceable life. Census clerks want 60 pulls, 1 for each million forms. Woolworths demands 81 for each candy counter restock. The committee splits the difference at 72. an agreeable multiple of both 6 and 12, and drafts recommended practice RP72. The number appears on dusty spec sheets even today, though nobody in shipping or receiving recalls. Its origin dot by the 1960s photocopiers belch warm ozone. Freshly collated packets await looping. An Ohio secretary invents the snap filing technique. Slip the loop over a folder corner, flip, snap, twist, secure a maneuver so satisfying colleagues. Secretly replicate it during lunch to relieve existential spreadsheets. Psychologists measuring office stress notice heart rates dip during repetitive banding, coining elastic reversion pulse. Corporate trainers briefly introduce 5-minute loop therapy. Upper management considers licensing before interest. Go slack like an overstretched no. 32 left on a radiator.digital decades march in. Hyper predictions plead extinction, yet invoices persist like stubborn weeds, and beige loops remain the gentlest mower. Factories automate slicing with lasers that smell faintly of toasted vanilla. Environmental audits scold latex harvest conditions. So fair trade bans emerge, stamped with tiny leaf icons no wider than a mustard seed. Customers marvel, then shrug, since loops vanish into desk drawers where ethical sourcing drifts off to nap among blunt thumbtacks. Meanwhile, hip cafes repurpose loops to bundle bamboo cutlery. Baristas flick them onto mason jar tips with aim suspiciously accurate, galvanizing the coins below. Tonight, somewhere beneath the drowsy hum of a fluorescent ballast, a clerk reseals. A half-used bag of chamomile with a single-size 32, twisting once, tucking the tail like a lullaby's final note. The band knows its task. Firm but not possessive, calm but not inert. Think of every quiet alliance at Echo Squad's thumb-knuckle guess. Ration drive pet talks, velvet runner discussions of 72 pulls. Feel its slow recoil guiding your own breath. Inhale to the stretch, exhale to the settle. Let thoughts wander the beige circumference, meeting themselves where tension yields to rest. Should a crack one day appear along the loop's patient arc, accept the fracture, for it only signals an invitation to stillness paper stacked. Ledgers closed, wishes whispered, deadlines paused. In that moment, even time might loosen, relax its claims, and drift harmlessly into the cushion of darkness where no paperwork follows and every weary loop at last can lie flat. You might not expect the tiny offset of a pale manila tab, 7/8 of an inch of cardboard shaved into a half smile at the folder's crown, to have refereed so many budget approvals. Birthday rosters and municipal memos, yet the modest. 3-position file tab has been nudging human paperwork into left, center, and right obedience since a spring morning in 1903. If you're still awake by the time I tiptoe through the 1947 elastic quorum, feel free to subscribe, or simply drift along as the tabs take their places, one quiet third at a time, until even the alphabet decides it has nowhere urgent to be. The tale begins in the back office of Calvert and Dodge Stationery Brokers, Cincinnati, where junior clerk Lucinda Fells wrestles with a stack of correspondence as tall as her unslept hair. The only folders at hand boast full-width tabs, each labeled in stubborn copperplate, MISC. Craving footholds amid the paper swell, Lucinda trims away 2/3. Of one tab, scoots the fragment left, and instantly spots her invoices without craning. The shears squeak once, twice in a colleague 2 desks down emits a contented Within the hour, 3 more folders undergo similar surgery. The desks see parts into neat archipelagos, and Lucinda's improvised geometry drifts toward destiny. On the draft of an open transom window, .news flutters outward on red cotton air. Calvert and Dodge salesmen boast of Lucinda's lane change filing, promising calm to law firms weary of alphabet avalanches. Printers oblige, die-cutting sample folders with tabs measured in gentle thirds. Position 1 keeps portside vigil, Position 2 floats mid-fairway. Position 3 stands starboard. Early adopters include an insurer in Des Moines, whose clerks say the tabs mimic wheat rows along Iowa highways and a violin repair shop in Krakow, where bow repairs are filed by squeak severity instead of date because the tri-tap rhythm pleases the luthier's ear. Micro-hooks sprout like paper clips. In Edinburgh, a librarian logs how often patrons pluck a left tab first 92%, concluding the human. Gaze favors westward exploration, perhaps hoping the eye will circle the globe and return for tea. In Veracruz, a citrus exporter dyes his tabs pastel orange and learns tax officials linger 17 seconds less per audit, distracted by the faint peel fragrance. An Amsterdam bicycle registry adds rubber flaps beneath center tabs so grease can hide their politely sparing. Lease agreements from oily fingerprints. Everywhere, modest cardboard nudges behavior with the hush of a librarian tapping her desktop by 1915. Filing cabinets themselves evolve little ribs to cradle thirds precisely. Machinists draft blueprints where draw rails line up with imaginary. Dubrovnik cobblestones, this flourish matters to exactly one engineer who once holidayed there, yet it survives every patent diagram. Manufacturers lop dimensions, cut depth half an inch, reveal height 3/16, gap between tabs never less than the width of Thursday's coffee spoon. At the National Bureau of Standards, a committee debates whether the center tab should drift one hair left to appease symmetry. The motion ties, then expires when a stenographer's fountain pen runs dry. The meeting adjourning for sandwiches instead of resolution. War interrupts, but even rationing cannot forbid order. Cardboard grows thinner. Tabs shrink by a grudging 16th. Clerks adapt, writing smaller, whispered titles so ink will acquiesce. A magistrate's secretary invents the diagonal scribble tilting words to maximize letter height and accidentally spawns a sideways gossip script future historians misread as code. Detroit automobile drafters, short of new folders, laminate the skip boxes and file blueprints under headings like cranky and sorta cranky, trusting the tab trio to save them from chaos all the same. Peace returns with rainfall of paperwork. Ministries bloom committees naming everything, each needing a folder. In 1947, the Library of Congress hosts tab tranquility trials, seating volunteers beneath fans whirring like distant applause. Subjects must locate one chart hidden among 1,000 folders. 2-position arrays cause frantic riffling. 5-position arrays induce melodic chaos, but the 3-position set yields retrieval in 10.2 seconds flat, the sweet spot where haste coexists with harmony. The report, stamped for internal calm, circulates quietly until its findings appear, uncredited in every office supply catalog from Bangor to Brisbane. The 60s flirt with color-coded side tabs that bloom like psychedelic ticket stubs. Yet, accountants, reconciling invoices steeped in tie-dye panic, revolt and return to beige trinity. A Melbourne architect proposes hexagonal tabs for radial filing. The prototype dazzles trade show browsers who then forget to order any. By 1978, a patent issues for fold-under index concealment, promising tabs you can hide if modest, expose if proud. Reviewers deem it existential and carry on labeling. Computers arrive, threatening paper sovereignty, yet printers hum. And someone must cradle the printouts. Software pioneers discover code comments fit neatly on center tab scrap. Startup founders order mint green folders, labeling them someday and investors. The rhythm continues, left for contracts, center for dreams, right for receipts you'll probably never reconcile. Psychologists measure tiny dopamine pops each time a new folder slides home-proof enough that tranquility can fit inside 3 cardboard teeth. Tonight, an overworked nurse files 10 requisitions, gloves squeaking against manila. She nudges a right tab forward, its neighbor middle. its neighbor left, and savors the tuck-tuck-tuck cadence no louder than water against a breakwater. Hear the soft rasp of manila on manila. Notice your own breath syncing with the ancient thirds ratio. Think of Lucinda's scissors pausing just long enough to envy sunrise through warehouse glass, then returning to their precise rebellion. If thoughts still loiter, imagine a drawer that runs beyond the edge of constellations, every folder courteous enough to lean just a hair aside for the newcomer. Select a slot left if yesterday still tugs at your sleeve, center if this moment feels gently adequate, right if tomorrow waves from the end of the hall, and settle into that breathing space. Feel the rail glide shut with the side too soft too. Wait the dust. Somewhere an uncut tab waits, anonymous and patient, saving a gap only you will notice. Let it keep your place among the quiet things while you drift, pleasantly unfiled, toward sleep.